Hello, hello, and welcome to another episode of IRL Horror. I'm your host, Boo, and today we are talking about children that have seemingly vanished into thin air, many of them in forests. Is something sinister afoot? With lots of twists and unexpected turns along the trail of this story, you don't want to miss it. Do you like hiking? Being very much a city girl, I don't have much experience with hiking, especially these days. I did camp and hike a little as a kid, but the forests always kind of creep me out. I was always getting afraid of getting lost, taking a wrong turn, inexplicably falling off a cliff that appears out of nowhere, being eaten by a bear or a bug or a something. I don't know. I just think forests are scary. Although nature is beautiful, and there happens to be lots of beautiful forests in the United States. But today we're going to focus on some in California. On the morning of August 6th, 1956, 11-year-old Brenda Howell and her 13-year-old friend Dawn Baker rode their bikes to Angeles National Forest. The forest has plenty of reviews about its beautiful hiking trails and scenery. It's located in the San Gabriel Mountains and Sierra Pelona Mountains in Southern California and was established as a national forest in 1908. It covers 700,176 acres of land. So it's quite big and has lots of rough terrain and lots of history. Some of it, not so great. Brenda and Dawn never made it back out of the forest. They were never seen again. After a large search was conducted, the only things recovered from the two of them were their bikes that were in fine condition and Dawn's jacket. Brenda wasn't from the area. She was visiting her adult sister for the summer, and it was coming up on the end of her trip. It was apparently reported that Brenda didn't want to go home or go back to school, and police took the stance that there was no foul play suspected, and the two of them must have run off together. I know that times were different in the 50s, but it seems incredibly unreasonable to me that this was their conclusion. Why would the kids leave perfectly good bikes and a jacket? Where would they go? How would they survive? It just it just doesn't make much sense. I'd venture to say that most kids don't want summer to end and don't really want to go back to school, especially in the middle of summer while they're having fun. I know I didn't. The search for Brenda and Dawn stops. Nothing comes from it. The case, although officially no foul play is suspected, goes cold, and no one ever hears from or sees them again. What could have happened to them? If the police really thought no foul play, why didn't they suspect that they had been injured or something along those lines? Knowing they had been in the forest and without any other signs or sightings of them? Brenda wasn't from the area. How well could she know the terrain and her way around? I just don't see how the conclusion is, oh, those two silly kids must have hated school and fallen in love or something stupid like that, instead of, oh my God, maybe they're hurt or lost or some giant forest bug ate them, even. I don't know. But even without a search coming up with real answers, especially no hurt kids, that actually doesn't mean all that much. There have been plenty of reports of children going missing, especially in places like forests, where they're searched thoroughly, even multiple times, and nothing is found. Then they eventually search again and they do find the person. Even in cases where people know exactly where the person was last seen and which direction they went, finding people can be really hard to do, even with the technology we have now. So I'm not exactly bashing the police for missing the kids, but I am questioning their conclusions. Because, well, they were just lazy, stupid conclusions. Let's be real. Not even a year later, in 1957, 8-year-old Tommy Bowman and his family are hiking a trail in Altadena, California on March 23rd. Tommy states he's going to run ahead and does so. And his family never sees him again. A large search is conducted, and it comes up with nothing. The case goes cold. Another child vanished into thin air. in the forest. Yeah, this episode isn't making me like forests any more than I already didn't. Anyways, July 12th, 1960, 6-year-old Bruce Creeman was camping with a large group of children as a part of a summer camp near Buckhorn Flat in Angeles National Forest. He was playing with a couple other kids until he got separated. When they couldn't find him, he was reported within minutes to be missing. Massive search entailed, but there was no sign of him. Police assumed he had been injured in the forest because of the many cliffs and rough terrain around them, but he was never found. And again, the case goes cold. Now, we've already talked a little about how searches, especially in forests, can be tricky, and things can be missed. Even things that they don't know how they are missed get missed, if that makes sense. It's just a lot of ground to cover, and it's not like it's all flat and unobstructed. There's also animals and other things that change the area. It's not necessarily anyone's fault, it's just difficult, even today. If some of these stories didn't turn into some kind of local urban legend type things, or warnings to the kids in the areas to be safe in the forest, then I'd be shocked. If they're not, I propose we make one up. Keep these kiddos safe by scaring them, I guess. If it works, and better safe than sorry, right? Kids walking into forests, many of them the same forest, just to never walk back out. Not only never walk back out, but to never be seen again. Just no trace of them. What scary monster or evil spirit is out there snatching up children without a trace? The urban legend writes itself, really. It almost feels like something otherworldly, supernatural, ghost, monster, something. Because how does this happen and keep happening? And these poor families, these are children, people's children. Well, it turns out this story does get weirder, and it does have a monster. In 1970, Mac Ray Edwards walks into a police station with a teenage boy and tells them he needs to talk to them. He first tells them that he and this boy broke into his neighbor's home and kidnapped their 3 young daughters. He says he drove them to Angeles National Forest, instructed them to get out of his vehicle with the intention to assault and murder them because he knew that they now know who he is and he couldn't possibly let them live after all of that. So they get out, but they each escape and head off in their own directions. Knowing he's screwed, he's telling the police that he's done this, and obviously that the girls need to now go and be found. Now, thankfully, the girls were found, traumatized but safe, and were reunited with their family, which is all insane and just crazy to begin with. I mean, this is a super bold move. Not only did he break into their home, but he successfully kidnapped 3 kids. Now, look, I'm no expert, but that doesn't seem like the act of someone who has never done anything like this before to me. I think the police thought the same thing, but when they checked his name, all they could find was an arrest from long before for vagrancy. So nothing even close to what he is now confessing. And as far as anyone can tell, no other issues or involvement with the police. Which doesn't really mean anything. You can be the most evil person on the planet, and unless you've been caught before, how is anyone going to know, right? But apparently, that's not all Edwards wants to talk about. He starts telling them more because he feels like he needs to. He wants to get some stuff off his chest. Now, I don't know what was going through the officers' heads at this point, but I would boldly guess that they didn't wake up expecting any of this day. Or any day, really. This is just not something that happens every day. It's just not. Anyway, Edward starts confessing to more crimes, starting with one in 1953 of young 8-year-old Stella Nolan. June 20th, 1953, in Norwalk, California in the evening, he happens upon Stella and somehow lures her into his car and brings her to his house where he assaults her and eventually strangles her. He decides to dispose of her body by throwing her off a bridge, but then for whatever reason, goes back to check on her and realizes she isn't dead. So Instead of helping her or coming to his senses or something, he stabs her, ensuring she is no longer alive, and moves her body to a construction site. There are just no words for that, so let's just continue on. Now, Edwards worked and always worked, as far as I can tell, in the construction industry. So this would have been a place he was familiar with enough. He buried her in an embankment that went on to become a part of a freeway, which looks like the type of construction he would have been involved with. Police searched and tried to figure out what happened to Stella, but there was nothing. She had just vanished. No one saw anything. Police figured it was foul play, but Edwards was never someone on their radar because he had never been in trouble. He wouldn't have had been on any registry or have a record of note that they would have paid any attention to, and it doesn't look like he had any kind of connection with her. So he has now connected himself to the cold case of Stella that no one could ever solve, and he did tell them where they could find her body. He doesn't stop his story there, though. He then starts telling them about his 11-year-old sister-in-law and her 13-year-old friend, Brenda Howell and Dawn Baker, who went missing 3 years after Stella. You might remember their names from the beginning of this episode. These were the two that took an early morning bike ride to Angeles National Forest and never came back out, assumed to have run off together. No foul play suspected. Well, it turns out there was foul play, and an exceptionally bold move from Edwards, considering she was his own sister-in-law, and she had been staying with him for the whole summer. So apparently Edwards paid Dawn a few dollars to bring Brenda to the forest. A nice morning ride for the two of them. But what they didn't expect was for Edwards to be waiting for them on the trail. He managed to have Dawn follow him, beating him until he could then slit his throat, to which he then moved on to also slit Brenda's. He hid their bikes in Dawn's jacket and disposed of their bodies off of a cliff or hill or something along those lines. He did also tell the police where they could find their bodies, so they definitely didn't run off together, and I'm unsure if he had ever been a person of interest in their case, but I'm going to assume no, based off of the police conclusion that they had run off. It seems to me like Edwards should have been someone they paid closer attention to in this case, because of his relationship to Brenda. But that wasn't how it played out, and I couldn't find any information on whether or not he was ever suspected of anything there. I wish I could say that this is where he ended his confessions, but he didn't stop there. He tells police about how in 1968 he broke into a home intending to find a young girl, but instead he finds her 16-year-old brother, Gary Roche. Edwards decides that he needs to kill him because of it, so he shoots him. Gary fights back, and Edwards shoots him a few more times. Again, in 1968, another 16-year-old, Roger Madison, goes missing from his home. He was last seen leaving his home, where he then somehow comes into contact with Edwards. Roger went to school with Edwards' son, so he likely knew him, if just a little, and I would assume that would make him feel a little more comfortable with him. Somehow, and for who knows what reason, Edward stabs Roger and buries his body on the Ventura Freeway that was being constructed at the time. On May 16th, in 1969, 13-year-old Donald Todd was riding his bike. Unfortunately for him, he caught Edward's eye. He lured Donald by offering to help him find a job, but instead he tried to sexually assault him. Brave, young Donald fought back, so Edwards decides to shoot him instead, disposing of his body under a bridge. His remains were found the next day, but the case still went cold. So Edwards walks into a police station and confesses to kidnapping with the intention of sexual assault and murder of 3 children, and then goes on to confess to a handful of successful instances where he did the same things to other children. I couldn't imagine what was going on through the officer's head, and I sure as hell can't imagine what in the world was going on inside Edward's head. It's such an insane story, except it's all real. Edwards is arrested on 2 counts of murder and 3 counts of kidnapping. The murder charges being for Donald and Gary, since their bodies had been found. Now, Edwards does tell them where he's hidden the bodies of the others he's confessed to. They do manage to recover the body of a young girl that seems to be around the ages of 8 and 10. They do believe this is Stella. They then go and look where he told them to for Brenda and Donald. But because they were tossed and not buried, it had been so long, plus it was the wilderness with rough terrain, there was no recovery of any evidence or bodies in their case. As for Roger, they couldn't just go and recover him because they would have had to shut down the freeway for an unknown amount of time. So they put a pin in that for the time being. Edwards was sentenced to death in 1970, but he decides that he has one last thing he wants to get off his chest first. In true Edwards fashion, apparently. He tells police that he has killed 18 children, and not just the 6 he confessed to. Not to mention the 3 he confessed to trying to kill. Apparently, the number changes, but he insists on more than just the original 6. I think maybe it was assumed that he was confessing to more so that he could stay alive, put off his execution for later because they would have to get more information from him, perhaps more trials. I'm not sure how that would work, but that was rumored as far as I can tell, which seems like a valid thought process. On the other hand, I've also read that he wanted to be executed, that he didn't want to wait for it either. He tried to do it himself twice. I don't think that was his intention, though, because in 1971, he does end up killing himself. So he took his own life, unless the point was to just do it on his own terms. But the confession didn't stop any execution plans, it seems. So it looks like he just actually did want to get some more stuff off his chest, although nothing seemed to come from that specifically. Surprise, surprise. The story doesn't end here. No. Apparently, his own death was not the end of his reign of terror. All of these cases went cold until he confessed to them. All of them. He didn't even confess to all of them at first. It almost feels like no one really bothered. Surely in the case of Brenda and Dawn, at the very least. I mean, he had a really strong connection to the victim. The conclusion that they ran off together still baffles me. Like, that is a wild conclusion. It seems like a lot of people just accepted these blanket vanished or ran off answers. Like, people didn't look for these kids, tried to solve these cases. How often does this happen? How many kids go missing and no one even looks for them, really? How do people not look for them? Like, this actually is making me mad. Like, the more I read about this case, or like these cases in general, the more I'm like, how? How did this happen? I don't understand. So apparently, Edwards wrote a letter to his wife, Mary, Brenda's sister, telling her that he confessed to some of the crimes to help his friend, who was really the one that committed them. It's the only time he's mentioned anyone else being involved, aside from this teenage boy that was with him when he kidnapped the 3 sisters in 1970 and decided to confess. I can't find any other information on the supposed other person or the supposed teenage boy that helped him, but apparently he named the teenager helper when he originally confessed. Could it have been his son? I really don't know. I think, so look, from what I could find, Edward was married and had 2 kids. If it were his son, then perhaps it was a younger son, seeing as one of his victims was likely more comfortable with him because he went to high school with his son. Otherwise, I'm not sure how he found this teenage accomplice or who this other person could have been that was mentioned in the letter. I'm not clear on that, and the information didn't seem to be available, maybe because they were underage, or it just wasn't made public in general, or maybe it was just never made clear to anyone. I guess he could have also just have been trying to save face with his wife in some sick way because he didn't want her to think he'd killed her sister still. But imagine being married to someone who did all that and you had kids with them. Like, that sucks. Truly. I feel really bad for his wife and family, or like anyone that was connected to him. Anyways, he does say that he was going to add one more confession to his first statement. Tommy Bowman was brought back to the police's attention decades later when author Weston DeWalt went down a rabbit hole. Seeing a picture of Edwards, he realized it looked familiar to a sketch he had seen of the last person to be seen with young Tommy. The case being quite similar to the others, Tommy runs off from his family one day, turning a corner, and then they can't find him. There was, however, some sightings of him with another man, even though he vanished at the forest or hiking trail. There was a sketch of this man, who resembled Edward's. So, although they wouldn't listen to this author in the first place, when he then brings them this information about the letter, they decide it must have been Edwards that killed Tommy. Finally, the police say, okay, there is likely more. Let's look into this. And they do. They look into similar situations, ages, areas where Edwards lived for missing or murdered cold cases. They find more. Ramona Price, 7. Bruce Creeman, 7. Dorothy Brown, 11. And Karen Tompkins, 11. Edwards is believed to be the murderer of these 4 children as well. In 2008, authorities were still trying to completely uncover the truth and give these families closure and answers for their children. They zoned in on where Roger was supposed to be buried. They brought in cadaver dogs that would alert to a specific area and looked underground with ground-penetrating technology, where they found something. So they started digging, but never found what the dogs were alerting to. They do the same thing around a bridge construction site Edwards had been working on, which would have made sense area and time-wise for another burial, and the same thing happened. They couldn't find anything, although the dogs had alerted. And because he was who he was and is also now not alive, we will probably never truly have the answers to how many people he killed or where they are. So there have never really been answers for most of these families. Where are these kids? Are there more? Who was the kid with Edwards? Was there someone else involved? Are there more kids buried under bridges and freeways, or thrown into water or off cliffs because of this monster? We'll never know. But what we do know is he, unfortunately, isn't the only monster out there. So I guess the urban legend really did write itself. The monster just isn't some supernatural entity. It was a very sick person, as the monsters usually are. I often like to dig into their brains a little and try to figure out how or why they did what they did. But with this one, I just don't know. His victims, as far as we know, were all minors with a wide age range and both male and female. His methods for killing them seem to all be different, and while some of his victims seem to have been planned hits on his part, others seem like they were opportunistic. He didn't seem to want to give anyone straight answers. And why did he confess to murders he would have gotten away with otherwise? Why did he confess to planning on killing the children he confessed to kidnapping? I have way more questions than I was able to find answers for, and that in itself is terrifying. As always, I'd like to give a moment to acknowledge the lives of those lost too soon, because this is really about them, about their voices, about something that happened to them that took their bright futures away, something that they can't speak to anymore, something that should have never happened. These weren't tragic accidents. These were the deliberate actions of an individual who took it upon himself to end these lives, and no one deserves that. No one has the right to decide that. So, let's not forget. Let's give them a voice. Stella Nolan, Gary Roche, Donald Todd, Brenda Howell, Donald Baker, Roger Madison, Thomas Bowman, Bruce Creeman, Karen Tompkins, Dorothy Brown, Ramona Price, and to any of those that we can't name. I'm not sure how anyone can truly prevent something like this, but please, keep your children close. Practice safe measures while hiking and camping and stay vigilant. If someone or something doesn't seem right, trust your instincts and teach your children to do the same. Thank you for listening. Until next week, stay spooky and please stay safe.